Today, there are over 8 billion people on Earth. We are everywhere. Cities, farms, mountains, deserts. We have built skyscrapers, sent rockets to Mars, created the internet. We have dominated this planet in a way that no other species has ever done. However, if you were to look at Earth 900,000 years ago, the picture would have been strikingly different. There were only 1,280 people alive on the entire planet. Not 1.28 million, not 128,000, but just 1,280 breeding stock. That's it. The entire future of humanity hangs in the balance so thin that it's almost impossible to believe we're here today. If you use these to sleep, then I literally make them. So subscribe and tell me where you are and when. I checked the comments and it's like Berlin for breakfast, Boston at bedtime all at once. You know that feeling when you realize how close you came to disaster? Just like when you slam on the brakes and miss that truck by an inch? This happened to our entire species, not for more than a second. It was 117,000 years without much waiting. And here's the real mystery. No one knew it had happened until 2023. Look, scientists have always suspected that humans went through some kind of population crash in our distant past. We have an oddly low genetic diversity compared to other animals. The genetic diversity of chimpanzees, who live in small groups scattered across Africa, is much higher than that of 8 billion humans combined. That's not normal. It's a sign of a bottleneck. But no one knew how severe it was. No one knew that it had almost killed everything before it even started. The story begins 5 years ago with a guy named Wang Shu at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He's running genetic analyses on modern human populations, trying to understand our evolutionary history. Standard stuff. He's looking at the DNA of more than 3,000 people around the world, tracking mutations over time like a molecular clock. Then he sees something strange in the data. About 900,000 years ago, the genetic signatures collapse. It's like watching a movie where 99% of the actors suddenly disappear from the screen. The mathematical models are screaming that something catastrophic has happened, but the numbers are so extreme. Who wouldn't believe it at first? He thinks it's a mistake, a flaw in his analysis, because if these calculations are correct, then human ancestors turned out to be a population smaller than a typical high school. He spends years double-checking, triple-checking, running the analysis over and over again with different methods. The same result every time. 98.7% of human ancestors went extinct about 930,000 years ago, and the survivors have remained in extremely small numbers for more than 100,000 years. Now, that's a lot longer than modern humans have existed as a species. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so our ancestors went through a tough time. Big deal. Species always come back from near extinction, right? Wrong. When populations get that low, they usually don't come back. They die out. Mathematical models show that once you get down to about 1,000 individuals, you enter what biologists call an extinction vortex. Genetic problems pile up. Reproduction increases. Random disasters can wipe out entire groups. Most species that reach such low numbers are gone forever. But somehow, our ancestors didn't go extinct. For 117,000 years, they survived. Through ice ages, through droughts, through the extinction of countless other species, a small population of early humans spread out to who knows where, keeping the flame of humanity alive when it should have been extinguished. What makes this discovery even more incredible is the length of time. 900,000 years ago, we were thrown right into what geologists call the early Central Plains transition. This was a time when the Earth's climate went completely crazy. Before this time, ice ages had come and gone in relatively 41,000-year cycles. The planet would cool down, ice sheets would grow and then warm up again. Tough but manageable. But about 900,000 years ago, everything changed. The ice age cycles shifted to a brutal 100,000-year pattern. Glaciers became massive, covering vast swaths of the northern continents. Sea levels dropped hundreds of feet. Ocean temperatures plummeted. And in Africa, where our ancestors lived, the climate became incredibly harsh and dry. Imagine, you were a primitive human, maybe Homo erectus or one of their descendants, who had previously lived in lush forests. Over generations, your world was turning into a dry desert. Your water sources were disappearing. The animals you hunt are becoming extinct. There was a shortage of plant foods. And it wasn't getting better. It was getting worse over thousands of years. Scientists call this a perfect storm for a mass extinction. And that's exactly what happened to most human populations. They were wiped out. Only a tiny group managed to survive somewhere in Africa. We don't know exactly where. We don't know how, but they survived. Now, this is where the story gets even more embarrassing. During this disruption, something unprecedented happened to human genetics. 2 of our ancestors' chromosomes fused together, merging into just 1. That's why humans have 46 chromosomes, while our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, have 48. Chromosome fusions are incredibly rare. They happen once every million years, and they happened right in the middle of our near-extinction event. This was no coincidence. See, when populations are very small, unusual genetic changes can spread through entire groups much faster than normal. If a person has this chromosome fusion and lives to reproduce, their children will carry it. And in a population of just 1,280 people, this type of genetic change can become universal within a few generations. Today, every person on Earth carries this fused chromosome. There are 8 billion of us. It's chromosome 2, and it contains the genetic signature of the 117,000 years when humanity nearly went extinct. Scientists can actually pinpoint the exact spot where the fusion occurred. They can see the molecular scars from when 2 ancient chromosomes were joined together. It's like forensic evidence at one of the most important crime scenes in human history. But chromosome fusion has done more than just reduce our number of chromosomes. Some researchers believe it can alter brain development. Genes near the fusion site affect how the nervous system works. It's possible that genetic changes during the disruption contributed to the evolution of larger, more complex human brains. Think about it. Our intelligence, our ability to create art, music, and technology, our capacity for language and abstract thought. All of these can be traced back to a genetic accident that happened when there were only about 1,000 people left on Earth. The evidence of this disruption is written like a time capsule in our DNA. Every human alive today carries the molecular signature of 117,000 years of living. Population geneticists can see it in patterns of genetic variation, in the mathematical fingerprint of a time near extinction.
But for decades, no one could properly interpret the signal. See, the old genetic analysis methods were like trying to read a book through a keyhole. Scientists could detect something that had happened in our past, but they couldn't see the whole picture. They knew that humans had gone through at least one major population disruption. Well, probably when our ancestors left Africa about 60,000 years ago. But they had no idea that before that, there had been a more serious one. Finally cracking the code required the development of new computational tools, such as the FitCol method developed by Wang Zhu and his team. These new techniques can simultaneously analyze thousands of genomes and identify genetic changes that occurred about 1 million years ago. When he first published his findings in the journal Science in 2023, the scientific community was stunned. Not just because of how severe the disruption was, but because of how long it lasted. Most population disruptions in evolutionary history are relatively short-lived. Volcanic eruptions wipe out most species, then the survivors multiply rapidly to fill the empty ecological niche. Or a disease kills 90% of the population, but the remaining 10% recover within a few generations.
But 117,000 years? That's not a disruption. It's like an extended near-death experience for an entire species. Nick Ashton, an archaeologist at the British Museum who reviewed the study, put it best. This means that the surviving population occupied a very local area where it had good social cohesion to survive. Even more surprising is the estimated duration of survival for this small group. If that's true, one might imagine that this would require a stable environment with ample resources and very little stress on the system. In other words, somewhere in Africa there was a pocket of stability, a haven where a small group of primitive humans could find everything they needed to survive, while the rest of the continent was being devastated by climate change. But where was this haven? What made it so special? How did you manage to maintain a stable population for over 100,000 years by hunting 180 people? These are the questions that keep scientists up at night. Some researchers think that the survivors lived near reliable water sources, perhaps around the Great Lakes in East Africa, or along rivers that still flowed even when the climate became harsh. Water meant animals could come to drink. Animals could find food. And water and food meant survival. Others believe that the survivors developed important technologies that other human populations lacked. Maybe they figured out a way to control fire more effectively. Fire changes everything. It allows you to cook food, which makes more nutrients available. It keeps predators away. It lengthens the day, giving you more time to work and socialize. Most importantly, it helps you survive in environments that would otherwise kill you. Archaeological evidence shows that about 800,000 years ago, the use of fire by human populations suddenly increased. This period coincides almost perfectly with when the genetic barrier ended and the human population began to expand again. Coincidentally? Probably not. But here's where it blows your mind. The fossil record from this period is almost completely empty. From 950,000 to 650,000 years ago, there were hardly any human fossils found anywhere in Africa or Europe. For a long time, anthropologists called this the fossil gap and couldn't explain it. Now we know why. There weren't many people to leave behind fossils. With only 1,280 breeding animals scattered over who knows how much land, the chances of any of them dying in conditions where their bones could be preserved for hundreds of thousands of years were incredibly slim. It's like finding a needle in a haystack, but there aren't many needles, and the haystack is the size of a continent. The few fossils we have from this period come mostly from Europe and Asia, not Africa, which means they probably represent human populations that weren't directly part of this barrier. Perhaps the sharp population decline only affected certain groups of early humans, while others in different regions may have been able to survive in slightly larger numbers. This makes sense when you think about it. Africa is a huge continent with a diverse climate and ecosystem. While some regions may have become uninhabitable during the climate crisis, others may have remained relatively stable. But the genetic evidence is clear. The ancestors of all modern humans, as well as Neanderthals and Denisovans, went through this extreme barrier. We are all descendants of those 1,280 survivors. Every person reading this story carries the DNA of a small population that refused to give up during the worst climate crisis in the history of human evolution. Scientists estimate that we lost about 65% of our total genetic diversity during this disruption. That's a huge amount. For comparison, when modern humans left Africa about 60,000 years ago, the famous founder effect reduced genetic diversity by about 15%. This loss of genetic diversity has consequences that we still suffer today. This is why humans are unusually susceptible to certain diseases, why our immune system's relatively weak compared to other primates. Why are rare genetic disorders relatively common in humans in more diverse populations? In a way, our vulnerability is evidence of our greatest triumph. Every genetic vulnerability we carry proves that our ancestors were tough enough to survive when survival seemed impossible. But the story doesn't end with survival. The most incredible part is what happened next. About 813,000 years ago, something changed. The population of primitive humans began to grow again. Not slowly, but rapidly. Within a few thousand years, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors had spread out of Africa and beyond. They invented new technology. They made more advanced tools. They began to hunt larger animals more effectively. They began to build shelters and control fire more systematically. Most importantly, they began the evolutionary journey that would eventually lead to the three most successful species in human history: modern humans, Neanderthals, and the mysterious Denisovans. The timing is too perfect to be a coincidence. Genetic evidence suggests that the last common ancestor of all three species was alive at the exact time the barrier ended. It's as if the near-extinction event didn't just test our ancestors' survival skills, but also transformed them into something new, stronger, more adaptable, something that could not only survive in a hostile world, but eventually dominate it. One of the scientists who discovered the bottleneck, Yi-Huan Pang, put it this way: "This groundbreaking discovery opens up a new field in human evolution because it raises many questions, such as where these individuals lived, how they overcame catastrophic climate change, and whether natural selection accelerated the evolution of the human brain during the bottleneck." That last part is crucial. Natural selection during the bottleneck. When population sizes are extremely small, evolution doesn't work as it should. Normally, genetic changes spread slowly through large populations. Beneficial mutations take hundreds of generations to become common. Harmful ones take time to disappear. But in a population of 1,280 individuals, evolution proceeds at lightning speed. Beneficial traits can spread throughout the group in a matter of generations. Individuals with a slight advantage in survival or reproduction can quickly dominate the gene pool. For 117,000 years, our ancestors were essentially living in an evolutionary pressure cooker. Only the smartest, hardest-working, most adaptable individuals survived to pass on their genes. Generation after generation has gone through intense natural selection, selecting for the very traits that would later make humans so successful. Problem-solving skills, social cooperation, tool use, communication skills, the ability to adapt quickly to changing environments and learn. All of these traits were probably refined and amplified around the time of the extinction 117,000 years ago. Genetic barriers weren't just something our ancestors survived, they were something that made us. And what did that actually look like? Surviving 117,000 years of evolutionary hell. Let's go back a long way. It's 930,000 years ago, and the Earth is being destroyed. Not in a dramatic explosion or asteroid strike. Slowly, mercilessly, one failed crop at a time. You're part of a small group of early humans, maybe 30 or 40 people. Your species doesn't have a name yet. Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis. Scientists are still arguing about the details. What matters is that you are human enough that your children's children's children, thousands of generations from now, will eventually become us. And now you see your world disappearing. The forests your parents hunted in are turning into scrubland. Scrubland is turning into desert. Year-round rivers are now seasonal streams, then dry flats marked only by cracked mud. Your group is constantly moving, following drying water sources, following dwindling herds, following fading hopes. This is not a drought. The drought is over. This is the new normal. Earth's orbital patterns have shifted into a nightmarish pattern. The ice sheets in the north are growing massive, trapping so much water that sea levels are dropping hundreds of feet. The Mediterranean has become a series of small lakes. Land bridges are appearing between continents. But ice is not killing your people. Ice does that to Africa. See, when huge ice sheets form in the north, they create a kind of atmospheric dam. Weather patterns that used to bring regular rainfall to Africa were disrupted. The monsoons that fed the continent's rivers became weak and erratic. What had once been forest turned into grasslands. Grasslands turned into deserts, and deserts became barren. Scientists have a name for what happened to Africa during this period: desiccation. The continent wasn't just dry, it was terribly dry. Fossil evidence shows that most large mammals went extinct. Antelope species that had survived for millions of years suddenly became extinct. Elephant populations were wiped out. When the large animals died, everything else followed. Predators starved, scavengers starved, and anything that depended on hunting or scavenging, like primitive humans, was faced with a choice: adapt or die. Most chose poorly. But your small group, your group of 1,280 people, was scattered across the continent. You found something that others missed. Maybe it was a mountain range that still had enough rainfall to sustain a few trees. Maybe it was an underground aquifer that kept springs flowing even after everything else had dried up. Maybe it was a rift valley that created its own microclimate. Whatever it was, it worked for 117,000 years. Now let's talk about what it meant to work. Forget what you think about human evolution being a steady march toward progress. There was no progress during the hiatus. Survival was the only possibility. Your group probably lived in groups of 20 to 30, extended families, everyone related to everyone within a few generations. You had to live with only 1,800 breeding individuals in total. You couldn't choose who you partnered with. Inbreeding was inevitable. Genetic disorders were probably common. Birth defects, developmental problems, reduced fertility, such small consequences for the gene pool. But somehow, you survived. The daily routine was brutal. Wake up, find water, find food, don't die. Repeat for 100,000 years. Water always came first. In a landscape where most rivers dried up half the year, knowing where to find a reliable source of water meant the difference between life and death. Your people probably acquired an almost supernatural ability to read the land, to detect signs of groundwater, to predict which seasonal rivers would flow the longest. You may have learned to dig simple wells, perhaps by digging holes with sticks and stones. But even a crude well connected to groundwater could sustain a family during the dry season. Food was even more demanding. After most large animals went extinct, you could no longer rely on hunting as your ancestors had. You became what anthropologists call dietary generalists. You ate everything. Insects, always insects, termites, crickets, beetles, etc. Pound for pound, insects are one of the most nutritious food sources on the planet, and they reproduce quickly, so even small populations can be sustainably harvested. You ate roots, tubers, anything underground that was protected from heat and drought. You learned which plants were edible in different seasons, which were poisonous if not prepared properly, which could be preserved for the time of drying. You became an expert at finding eggs, bird eggs, reptile eggs, anything with protein. You probably learned to follow certain animals to their nests, timing your expeditions for maximum yield without destroying future breeding. And sometimes, when you were lucky, you would find meat. Your ancestors were not the giant woolly mammoths that hunted in packs of dozens. Those are long gone. But smaller animals, a young deer separated from its herd, an injured zebra, an old elephant dying of thirst. This is where fire became crucial. Primitive humans had been using fire for millions of years, but during this time of disruption, fire wasn't just useful, it was the difference between life and death. Cooking meat made it safe to eat, killing parasites and bacteria that could wipe out your entire family.
More importantly, cooking breaks down tough proteins and makes nutrients more readily available. You can get more calories from the same amount of food. Cooking plants was even more revolutionary. Many roots and tubers are indigestible or even toxic when raw, but cooking them makes them a major source of carbohydrates. Some researchers think this is when humans first learned to systemically process plant foods. But fire did more than just improve your diet. It lengthened your days. Without artificial light, most animals are helpless after dark. Predators hunt, prey hide. Everyone is basically shut up until sunrise. But with fire, your group can stay active after sunset. You can work on tools, repair shelters, share information about where you got water or food. Most importantly, you can strengthen social bonds. And social bonds were everything during this time of disruption. With such a small group, you can't tolerate conflict. Every individual was valuable. Lose one adult to combat, accident, or disease, and the entire group was weakened. Lose several, and you might not survive the next bad season. So, you acquired cooperative skills that would make modern diplomats jealous. You learned to share resources despite scarcity. You learned to resolve conflicts without violence. You learned to care for the sick and injured instead of abandoning them. Most importantly, you learned to share knowledge. When one individual discovered a new water source, everyone learned about it.
When someone figured out how to process a poisonous plant to make it edible, that knowledge spread quickly through the group. When hunters developed a new tactic for tracking prey, it became common knowledge within days. This wasn't just good manners, this was a survival strategy. In a population this small, losing stored knowledge could be catastrophic if someone died. So you developed oral traditions, teaching methods, ways of passing information from one generation to the next. You became obsessed with teaching children not just basic skills, but everything. Where to find water in each season, which plants are safe, how to read animal movements, how to predict weather patterns, how to make and maintain tools. Children who learned quickly were more likely to survive. Children who learned quickly were more likely to reproduce. Over thousands of generations, you were evolving into something new. Genetic evidence suggests that during the bottleneck, human brain size began to increase, not dramatically, but rather. It would come later, but measurably. Fossil human brains from just after the bottleneck have significantly more brain capacity than before. It makes sense. When survival depends on outsmarting your environment, natural selection favors larger, more capable brains. Even if a larger brain required more power, that was extremely scarce during the crisis. But it wasn't just raw intelligence that was evolving. It was specifically social intelligence. Living in small groups for thousands of generations, you became incredibly adept at reading others, predicting their behavior, knowing when to trust, when to be wary, when to share, when to withhold. You developed what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people's thoughts and intentions are different from yours. While it sounds simple, it's actually one of the most complex cognitive abilities in the animal kingdom, and you were refining it under unimaginably intense survival pressures. The archaeological record from this period is disappointingly sparse, but what we do have is fascinating. Tools became more sophisticated, but also more standardized, as small groups developed consistent ways of making things and shared those strategies widely. Stone tools from the late barrier period show what archaeologists call cultural convergence. Similar patterns appear in different regions at roughly the same time. This suggests communication networks between groups, trade routes, even regular gatherings where groups would meet to exchange not just goods, but knowledge and genes.
Because here we are talking about those 1,280 breeding individuals. They weren't all living in one place. Basic population genetics tells us that they had to spread out. Put 1,280 people in a valley and a single disaster, a flood, a drought, a disease outbreak, a volcanic eruption could wipe them all out. Evolution doesn't make those kinds of mistakes. So they were scattered. Groups of maybe 20, 30 people were separated by hundreds of miles, connected by networks of kinship and trade, but living so independently that no single disaster could wipe them all out. As a result, biologists have created a metapopulation structure. Individual groups rise and fall, disappear and are replaced, but the overall network survives. It's like a game of tug-of-war, but with human population without a bladder, and the hammer being drought, disease, and climate change. Some groups get hit and disappear, but others survive, breed, and send out migrants to repopulate the empty territories. For 117,000 years, this desperate game continued. Some generations probably lived relatively well, finding good territory with reliable resources. Others suffered terribly, watching children die of starvation and disease. But somehow the network survived. And then, about 813,000 years ago, something changed. The first signs were subtle. Slightly more reliable rainfall in some areas. Grasslands were beginning to expand again after millennia of desertification. Animal populations were beginning to recover. The extremes of the climate crisis were coming to an end. But by this time, your people were not the same species that had entered the barrier. 117,000 years of intense natural selection had transformed them, making them smarter, more cooperative, better adapted to survive in harsh environments. They had developed technologies that would have seemed like magic to their ancestors. More advanced tools, more sophisticated fire management techniques, better food processing techniques. Most importantly, they had developed social systems capable of sustaining cooperation and knowledge sharing across multiple generations. When the climate began to improve, they were ready. Population growth was explosive. Within a few thousand years, the descendants of those 1,280 survivors had swelled to millions, maybe even tens of millions. They found refuge in times of crisis from all corners of Africa and began to colonize areas that had been empty for ages. But this is where the story really gets wild. They weren't just expanding as one big happy human family.
The genetic bottleneck did something unprecedented for human evolution. It set the stage for the most important speciation event of our lineage. About 800,000 years ago, that single surviving population began to split into three distinct groups, three separate evolutionary paths that eventually led to the three most successful human species in history: modern humans, Neanderthals, and the mysterious Denisovans. Now, speciation usually takes millions of years, maybe millions of years. Species slowly diverge, accumulating differences generation after generation until they can no longer interbreed. But the barrier compressed and accelerated everything. 117,000 years of intense natural selection created a kind of evolutionary spring-loading. When the population finally expanded, it exploded in multiple directions at once. Think of it this way. You take a river and force it through the narrowest possible channel for 100,000 years. All that water pressure builds up. Then suddenly, you remove the barrier. The water doesn't just flow, it surges in every direction, carving new channels, creating new paths. That's what happened with human evolution after the barrier. The first group stayed in Africa. They would eventually become the ancestors of modern humans, Homo sapiens. But they weren't modern yet. They were still evolving, still refining the survival skills that carried them through the crisis. A second group moved north and west into Europe and Western Asia. These peoples found a world very different from the one their ancestors had known. Colder, more seasonal, full of new challenges and new opportunities. They adapted quickly. Within a few 100,000 years, they had developed a robust build, enlarged nasal passages, and cold weather adaptations that made them perfectly suited to Ice Age Europe. They became the Neanderthals. A third group moved east, spreading across Asia and eventually reaching Indonesia and New Guinea. We know less about them because they left fewer fossils, but we know they existed because their DNA can still be seen in modern populations across Asia and Oceania. They were the Denisovans. All three groups carried the genetic signature of the bottleneck: the fused chromosomes, the reduced genetic diversity, and the neurological adaptations that had been selected for over that brutal 117,000 years. But they also began to develop their own unique traits. The African populations left behind faced a recovering but still challenging environment. They had to be adaptable, innovative, able to exploit a wide range of resources. As climate continued to fluctuate, natural selection favored intelligence, problem-solving ability, and the ability to quickly develop new technologies as conditions changed. Over millions of years, this population evolved what we now recognize as the core characteristics of modern humans: larger brains relative to body size, more gracile bone structure, and an increased capacity for symbolic thought. Most importantly, they developed behavioral modernity, the ability to make art, use symbols, and engage in abstract reasoning, the mental tools that anthropologists say would eventually help them dominate the planet. But that was still a long way off in the future. For now, they were one of three human species. All were competing for resources as they recovered from the greatest climate catastrophe in human history. Meanwhile, the Neanderthals were becoming something entirely different. Entering Europe during the recovery period, they entered an environment that was still terribly cold and seasonal. Winters that could last 8 months, summers that were short and unpredictable. They were incredibly strong and adaptable. Neanderthal skeletons display bone density and muscle mass that would make modern bodybuilders jealous. They developed massive nasal passages to warm and humidify the cold, dry air they breathed. Their brains actually grew larger than those of modern humans, perhaps to adapt to the complex challenges of Ice Age survival. But their most impressive adaptation was cultural. Neanderthals became master hunters.
Not just opportunistic scavengers like their predecessors, but also systematic tactical hunters capable of killing huge Ice Age mammals. They developed sophisticated spear-throwing techniques. They learned to hunt in coordinated groups, leading large animals to kill areas. They invented methods of preserving meat during the long winters, perhaps using natural refrigeration in caves and permafrost. Most notably, they developed the first systematic burial system in human history. Neanderthal graves show evidence of deliberate placement, sometimes with grave goods. This suggests that they developed symbolic thinking, the ability to imagine death as something meaningful, something worthy of ritual. They were no longer just surviving, they were creating culture. Denisovans were doing something similar in Asia, but we know less about their specific adaptations. What we do know is that they were incredibly successful. Genetic analysis of modern Asian populations shows Denisovan DNA from the Philippines to Tibet, indicating that they ranged over a vast range of environments. Some Denisovan populations adapted to high altitudes, developing genetic diversity that helped them more efficiently process oxygen in the thin air of the Himalayan plateau. This same genetic diversity is also seen in modern Tibetan populations today, evidence that ancient humans and Denisovans interbred, passing on survival genes that still help humans live at extreme altitudes.
Other Denisovan groups appear to have been skilled sailors. There is evidence that they reached islands in Southeast Asia, which would have required sophisticated boat building and navigation skills. This suggests that they developed maritime technology thousands of years before any other human species. But here's what's truly incredible about the three groups. They were still connected. Despite being spread across 3 continents and adapting to radically different environments, they were genetically close enough to interbreed when their ranges overlapped. When our ancestors left Africa about 60,000 years ago, modern humans and Neanderthals interbred. The Denisovans interbred with Neanderthals and modern humans at different times and places. Genetic evidence shows multiple episodes of interbreeding over millions of years. This tells us something profound about this barrier and its consequences. The nearly 117,000 years of extinction created a kind of genetic unity among all human populations. Despite evolving in different directions over millions of years, we were all fundamentally the same species. All still carried the chromosomal fusions that marked us as survivors of the barrier. All still shared the basic genetic toolkit that had been refined during those desperate millennia. But each group was also developing its own specialized survival strategies. The archaeological record of this period shows an explosion of technological innovation, not just within one group, but among all 3. In Africa, stone tool technology was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The simple choppers and tool axes that had been used by humans for millions of years were now replaced by carefully crafted spears, scrapers, and cutting tools tailored to specific tasks. More importantly, tool making became standardized. Archaeological sites across Africa show remarkably similar tool designs, indicating widespread communication and knowledge sharing between different groups. This is the signature of true cultural evolution. Ideas spread faster than genes, enabling rapid adaptation to new challenges and opportunities. In Europe, Neanderthals were developing their own technological heritage. They were the first to make hafted tools, spear points, and knives that were attached to wooden handles with plant resin and animal sinew. This may sound simple, but it represented a major cognitive leap. You had to plan ahead, gather multiple materials, and understand abstract concepts like speech and leverage. They also developed what archaeologists call ready-made stone tool-making techniques. Instead of simply chipping away at a rock until they found something useful, Neanderthals learned to carefully carve stone cores so they could make multiple identical tools from a single piece of raw material.
This is the planned, systematic production of a standardized product. The Denisovans were also innovating, although their successes are hard to track, but genetic analysis suggests they were the first human species to develop a systematic use of plant medicines. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan gene variants that help them process plant toxins, suggesting that their ancestors learned to use poisonous plants as medicine, developing resistance through natural selection. They were probably the first humans to practice systematic agriculture. Some researchers think that the genetic variants that help modern Asian populations digest starchy foods originated with Denisovans, who learned to cultivate and process wild grains. But perhaps the most important innovation occurred in social organization. All 3 post-barrier human species were developing increasingly complex social structures.
Extended family groups were forming alliances with other groups. Trade networks were emerging that could move raw materials and finished goods across hundreds of miles. It was no longer just about survival. It was the beginning of civilization. The genetic evidence of this social revolution is written in our DNA. During the post-barrier expansion, human population geneticists showed evidence of what geneticists call structured reproductive patterns. Not random mating, but the systematic exchange of marriage partners between groups. This suggests that our ancestors developed kinship systems, rules about who could marry whom. There were probably extensive gift exchange networks that maintained relationships between distant communities. They were creating the social glue that would eventually help human society evolve from small groups to tribes, principalities, and eventually states. But they were also creating something else, which would prove even more important in the long run: language. Now, no one knows when human language evolved. It doesn't turn up in fossils. We can only guess at its development from circumstantial evidence. But everything points to a period after the interglacial, when human communication became truly sophisticated. The rapid spread of standardized tool technology suggests complex information transfer. Evidence of trade networks suggests discussion and abstract reasoning. Neanderthal burial practices suggest symbolic thinking. Most clearly, genetic barriers created precisely the conditions in which complex language would be most advantageous. Small, scattered populations were trying to maintain connections across vast distances. The survival of individuals who needed to share detailed information about resources, dangers, and opportunities depended on the ability to learn complex skills quickly and teach them to their offspring. In this situation, any improvement in communication ability would provide a huge advantage for survival. Individuals who could speak more clearly, understand more precisely, or express information more effectively would be more likely to survive and reproduce. Over hundreds of generations, this selection pressure would make human communication abilities much more sophisticated than those of other species. When the three human species encountered each other again, modern humans meeting Neanderthals in the Middle East, Denisovans meeting both groups in Asia, they were capable of sophisticated verbal communication. They could share knowledge, negotiate alliances, and even tell stories of their ancestors who had died out 900,000 years ago. But they were also beginning to face new challenges. The world was filling up again. During the recovery period, there was an abundance of resources which were becoming competitive. And the three human species began to compete directly for the same territory and the same resources. The era of cooperation was coming to an end. The era of competition was about to begin. Then came the meeting that would determine the fate of humanity. 60,000 years ago, the descendants of those African survivors finally left their home continent. Not all of them, but just a small group, perhaps a few hundred individuals, who decided to cross the narrow body of water between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula.
They had no idea that they were about to meet their long-lost cousins. For more than 400,000 years, the three human species had been evolving in isolation. Modern humans in Africa, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, each perfectly adapted to their own environment.
Each had developed its own technology, its own culture, its own way of surviving. Now, they were about to face off. The first encounter probably took place somewhere in the Middle East, perhaps on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, where African migrants had gone to meet at the southern edge of Neanderthal territory. Imagine that moment. You are a modern human, part of a small group exploring new lands. Your people have never seen other people who are different from you. Then suddenly you see them across a valley. They are human, but not quite. Shorter and more powerful than your people. A forward-facing face with a huge frown and a huge nasal opening. A body built like a wrestler. All muscle and thick bones. Neanderthals. Your first instinct may be fear, curiosity, or aggression. We will never know what that initial encounter was like, but we know what happened next because it is written in our DNA. They interbred. Modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just fight for territory. They formed relationships. They had children together. Genetic analysis shows multiple episodes of interbreeding over thousands of years. Today, everyone of non-African descent carries about 2% Neanderthal DNA. That's the genetic signature of ancient encounters, evidence that when our species did come together, at least occasionally, they chose cooperation over conflict. But cooperation has its limits. The Middle East during this period was like a revolving door between species. The climate would change and modern humans would expand north. The climate would change again and Neanderthals would retreat south. Over thousands of years, the territory would change hands repeatedly. Sometimes modern humans would control the best hunting grounds. Sometimes Neanderthals would. But no one would establish lasting dominance until the rules of the game changed. About 45,000 years ago, modern humans developed what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Toolkit, a revolutionary technology that made them much more effective hunters and gatherers. Sophisticated spear throwers that could hurl projectiles with deadly accuracy. Bone needles that allowed them to make clothing suitable for cold weather. Fish hooks and nets that opened up aquatic food sources. Most importantly, they developed systematic blade production techniques to create long, sharp cutting edges from small amounts of stone. These were not just better tools, they were force multipliers, technologies that enabled small groups of people to achieve what had previously been required by much larger groups. A Neanderthal hunting party might have needed 20 men to take down a large animal. A modern human team with spear throwers and coordinated tactics could do the same with 8 men. Over time, the advantages of this skill have increased. Modern humans could maintain larger territories with fewer people. They could survive in marginal environments that would have challenged even the more powerful Neanderthals.
They could expand quickly into new areas and establish permanent settlements more easily. The Neanderthals, who had survived the Ice Age through their physical toughness and close group cooperation, were suddenly outcompeted by more technologically advanced species. But they did not perish without a fight. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing violence within human groups. Neanderthal sites contain more weapons. Modern human sites show evidence of fortifications. Skeletal remains bear signs of interpersonal conflict. This was not genocide. This was competition for the same resources between two species who were strong enough to want exactly the same things: water sources, hunting grounds, shelter, raw materials for tools, and increasingly, modern humans were winning. Not because they were stronger. Neanderthals were physically superior in almost every way. Not because they were smarter. That seems to be also wrong.
Neanderthal brains were actually larger on average. They won because they were more flexible. Neanderthals spent millions of years perfecting survival strategies for Ice Age Europe. They were incredibly good at what they did, but what they did was very specific. Modern humans, during the African recovery period, were selected for adaptability. They could quickly change strategies as conditions changed. They could use new food sources. They could change their tools and tactics to meet unfamiliar challenges. When the climate changed, and it changed constantly during this period, modern humans adapted. Neanderthals were stuck with successful but harsh survival strategies. Slowly, the Neanderthal population began to decline. First, they lost prime territory, river valleys, coastal areas, the best hunting grounds. Then they were pushed into more marginal areas, mountain valleys, northern forests, areas that modern humans had not yet sought. By 28,000 years ago, the last Neanderthals were living in southern Spain and Gibraltar, isolated populations living in sheltered areas that were shrinking every year. Then they were gone. The story in Asia was different, but followed a similar pattern. Modern humans encountered Denisovans about 50,000 years ago. We know less about this encounter because Denisovan fossils are incredibly rare. Most of what we know comes from genetic analysis, but the DNA tells a clear story. Like Neanderthals, there was interbreeding. Modern Asian populations carry Denisovan genetic diversity. Some Pacific Island populations are more than 6% Denisovan descendants. In contrast to the European situation, there appears to have been little direct competition between modern humans and Denisovans in Asia, the continent being so large that different groups could occupy different ecological niches for long periods of time. Denisovans, who had adapted to high altitudes, continued to live in the mountains. Those who had become seafaring specialists maintained control of the island chains. Modern humans initially occupied different areas, river valleys, coastal plains, areas that complemented rather than directly competed with Denisovans. But eventually, the same technological and demographic pressures that wiped out the Neanderthals began to affect the Denisovans as well. Modern humans were more efficient at exploiting resources.
They could support larger populations in the same area. They could expand more quickly and establish new settlements more easily. One by one, Denisovan populations were exploited, outcompeted, or displaced. Some may have survived until surprisingly recently. There is compelling genetic evidence that modern humans encountered Denisovans in Southeast Asia about 25,000 years ago. But they, too, eventually disappeared as distinct populations. By 20,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, modern humans, was the only human species on Earth. The descendants of those 1,280 isolates that survived the barrier outlived their evolutionary cousins who came from the same ancestral population. The three-way split that began 800,000 years ago is now complete. But why did modern humans succeed where Neanderthals and Denisovans failed? The answer brings us back to the barrier. During those 117,000 years of near extinction, all three species shared very specific traits: intelligence, cooperation, technological innovation, adaptability. But the African populations that were the ancestors of modern humans faced another challenge, one that their European and Asian siblings avoided. Even after the worst of the crisis was over, Africa remained climatically unstable. While Neanderthals adapted to the predictable patterns of Ice Age Europe and Denisovans specialized for specific Asian environments, modern humans had to adapt to constantly changing conditions. Periods of drought followed by floods for decades, seasonal patterns changed every few generations. Animal populations appeared and disappeared unexpectedly. These ongoing environmental pressures made modern humans evolutionarily flexible in ways that were not highly specialized. When the three species finally encountered each other, Neanderthals and Denisovans were like finely tuned racing cars, incredibly efficient in the right conditions, but difficult to change for new challenges.
Modern humans were like all-terrain vehicles, not perfectly optimized for any single environment, but capable of handling whatever came next. This flexibility was seen in a variety of ways. Technology. Modern humans have been constantly innovating, creating new tools and techniques every few thousand years. Neanderthals essentially used the same stone tool technology for over 200,000 years. It worked well, so they stuck with it. Social organization. Modern humans have developed larger, more complex social networks. They can bring more people together for large hunts or territorial conflicts. They have developed trade relationships that move resources across hundreds of miles. Population. Modern human populations can grow rapidly and recover quickly from disasters. When disease or climate disasters decimate a group's numbers, they bounce back within a few generations. Food. Modern humans have become extreme dietary generalists, eating everything from shellfish to large meats and processed plant foods. Neanderthals focused on large prey. Climate change was effective but weak when it affected hunting populations. But perhaps most importantly, modern humans developed more sophisticated communication abilities. Genetic barriers created selection pressure for complex languages across the three species. But modern humans, faced with a more variable environment and larger social networks, pushed verbal communication the furthest. They could coordinate the activities of large groups more effectively. They could share complex technological knowledge more accurately. They could maintain relationships over long distances and over long periods of time.
When modern humans faced Neanderthals or Denisovans, they weren't just competing for resources. They were competing with communication and organizational advantages they had built up over 400,000 years. It wasn't a fair fight. By 15,000 years ago, modern humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They had developed agriculture, permanent settlements, and complex societies. Once a population of just 1,280, they now numbered millions of speakers. They inherited all the survival skills of their ancestors, overcoming obstacles. But they also created something new, something their evolutionary cousins never achieved. Not just the ability to adapt to their environment, but the ability to completely remake it. The era of human dominance had begun, and it all started during that desperate millennium when survival hung by the thinnest thread. And somehow, improbably, 1,280 individuals refused to give up. Now here we are, 8 billion people, wherever you look. There are 14 million people in the Tokyo metro area. There are more than 15 million in Lagos. New York, London, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, cities so vast that from space they can be seen shining like galaxies against the dark earth. We have built an internet that connects every corner of the planet. We have mapped the human genome. We have sent robots to Mars and telescopes to the ends of the universe. We have created art that makes people cry and music that makes strangers dance together. We are the most successful species in the history of life on Earth. And every one of us, every person reading this, every child born today, every human being who has ever lived, carries the genetic signature of those 1,280 individuals who refused to give up 900,000 years ago. This is the part that really calms you down when you think about it. There are sequences in your DNA that have survived the worst climate catastrophes of our species, genes that have been tested and come through 117,000 years of near-extinction. Chromosomes that have been shuffled under impossible stress have made us stronger. The way your brain works, the way you solve problems, the way you cooperate with strangers, the way you learn language, the way you care for your children, all of these were shaped by those desperate millennia when survival required every conceivable advantage. You are proving that sometimes, against all odds, life finds a way. But this discovery means more than just a great origin story. It explains a lot about why humans are the way they are.
Ever wondered why we are so much better at cooperating than other primates? Why we can work together in groups of hundreds or thousands, while chimpanzees can outnumber humans by 50 individuals at most? Because our ancestors lived for over 100,000 years in such small populations that cooperation simply wasn't viable. It was the only way anyone could survive. Those who couldn't get along with others would die. Those who could share, teach, and work together would live long enough to pass on their genes. Over 4,000 generations, natural selection had been fine-tuning our ability to cooperate. Ever wonder why humans are so obsessed with teaching? Why do we spend years of our lives just showing children how to do what other animals learn through experimentation? Because in times of disruption, losing knowledge after someone dies can destroy an entire group.
Our ancestors, who were the best at passing on information to the next generation, were more likely to survive for millennia. This created the teaching instinct that allowed human societies to accumulate knowledge over generations. We didn't just survive through disruption. We became addicted to learning and sharing what we learned. Ever wonder why humans are so good with tools? Why are humans able to use everything from stone hammers to smartphones, while even intelligent animals like dolphins use tools in very limited ways? Because tool-making and tool use were literally life-or-death skills during the crisis. Those who could innovate, figure out better ways to gather food, light a fire, or build shelter were more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. We have evolved into a species that sees the entire world as raw material for solving problems. But constraints also explain some of our weaknesses. Ever wonder why humans are so susceptible to infectious diseases compared to other mammals? Why are we so susceptible to viruses that rarely affect other primates? Because we lost 65% of our genetic diversity during the crisis. This includes many of the immune systems that protect us from pathogens. We are all much more genetically similar than a species our size, making us vulnerable to diseases that can exploit common genetic vulnerabilities. Ever wonder why genetic disorders like sickle cell anemia or Huntington's disease persist in human populations when natural selection should have eliminated them? Because some of these disorders may provide advantages during bottlenecks, or they may be side effects of other traits selected for during bottlenecks. When your population drops to 1,800, genetic traits that would normally disappear can become entrenched in the entire species. We carry the scars and energy of a time when we were close to extinction. But perhaps the most profound significance is what this discovery tells us about human unity. Right now, in 2025, there are people who think that racial differences between humans make sense in some biological sense. People who believe that populations that look different or speak different languages are essentially different kinds of people. This bottleneck discovery completely erases that thinking. Everyone on Earth, literally everyone, descended from the same group of 1,280 individuals who lived 900,000 years ago. We've only been apart for a few thousand years, which is nothing in evolutionary terms. The genetic difference between any two humans is less than the difference found in a single population of chimpanzees. We're all relatives, recent relatives. When humans left Africa 60,000 years ago and spread across the world, they carried DNA with them to every continent. When they developed different skin colors and facial features to adapt to new climates, they were simply expressing different combinations of the same underlying genetic toolkit. The indigenous Australians, who arrived on their continents 50,000 years ago, the Europeans who survived the Ice Age, the Polynesians who crossed the Pacific Ocean using stick charts and star maps, the Native Americans who entered the Americas during the last Ice Age, all carry the genes of those 1,280 survivors, all products of the same evolutionary crucible. There is none. There is only us.
And we have always been a family, shaped by the same history of survival against impossible odds. It also has implications for how we think about modern challenges, for example, climate change. Today, we are facing another period of rapid environmental transformation, not as intense as what our ancestors endured 900,000 years ago, but serious enough to threaten human civilization. The discovery of the barrier suggests that we have reason for both concern and hope. Concern because past climate catastrophes have brought human populations to the brink of extinction. We are not defenseless. We are not guaranteed survival simply because we are intelligent, but rather because we carry the genetic legacy of the ultimate survivors. The ancestors who overcame the barrier were not just lucky. They were adaptable, innovative, cooperative. They were willing to completely change their way of life as circumstances demanded. Those traits are still with us. The same flexibility that helped our ancestors survive the transition from forests to savanna to desert. The same cooperation that brought small populations together through the millennial crisis. The same problem-solving abilities that created new technologies after the old methods stopped working. We are not the same species that entered the barrier 930,000 years ago. We're the species that emerged from it, tested, refined, proven to survive in conditions that would kill almost any other large mammal on the planet. But survival is not guaranteed. It never was. The researchers, Wang Su, Yuan Pan, and Haipeng Li and their team have given us more than just an amazing scientific discovery. They have given us a mirror. When we look at the genetic evidence of that 117,000-year extinction, we are not just learning about the past, we are learning about ourselves. We are the species that don't give up. The species that find a way to survive when survival seems impossible. The species that come through the disaster stronger and more capable than ever. But we are the species that could lose 99% of our population and be hanging on by our nails for over 100,000 years before things get better. This barrier is both a warning and a promise. A warning that human success is never certain. We are closer to extinction than most people imagine. Our current planetary dominance is not the inevitable result of being the chosen species, but the hard prize is the legacy of ancestors who survived conditions that destroyed almost everything. And a promise that we carry within our genes the ability to survive almost everything. We are the descendants of 1,280 of us, who saw the world crumbling around them and decided to forge ahead anyway. Every time you solve a problem, you are using skills refined during an obstacle course. Every time you collaborate with strangers, you are revealing behavioral patterns that have kept small groups alive for millennia. Every time you teach a child something new, you are participating in traditions of knowledge sharing that have carried important information across 4,000 generations of crises. 1,280 of us are alive, not metaphorically, but literally in our chromosomes, in the pattern of our nervous systems, in our capacity for resilience. 900,000 years ago, it seemed like human history was coming to an end. The climate had turned hostile. Most of the population had died out. A small group of survivors faced a world that seemed determined to kill them. They survived. They adapted. They multiplied. They spread across the globe and became us. Today, more than 8 billion people live on Earth. We have created cities that are home to millions, technology that connects billions of people, art, music, and literature that captures the full range of human experience. We are the descendants of the year 1080.
We are living proof that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, some individuals can be tough enough, smart enough, and cooperative enough to make the world habitable again. And if our ancestors could survive that, we can survive anything.